I call David Clendon.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I'm pleased to make some initial brief comments on this electronic monitoring of offenders bill. It could scarcely be described as a bold bill. It won't change the world, but it makes some useful and positive incremental changes to the parole and sentencing acts, largely as a response, I guess, to improvements of technology that enable some variations in sentencing and parole management of prisoners, which do provide alternatives to prison. And for that reason alone, the Greens would support it. And indeed, I should stress we are supporting this legislation. It'll come as no surprise to anyone to know we're no great fans of prisons as an alleged solution to offending, to crime. The Minister of Justice, the Honourable Mr English, has quite accurately described prisons as a moral and fiscal failure in the 21st century. And I think that awareness should underpin a lot of our work as we progress with considering how best to deal with matters around crime and what is appropriate in terms of imprisonment or not. So we are, as we've heard, of course, this legislation would allow some alternative sentencing for people sentenced to less than 2 years, rather paroling of those people. It deals with sentences of intensive supervision and enables electronic monitoring in those situations. There's all this violence and destruction on the government benches I won't refer to just now. So I should just make the point that the legislation and indeed the regulatory impact statement, other documents around the bill, do highlight the fact that there are issues around Bill of Rights Act with this legislation. That's been a conundrum, that's been a reality with many of these bills in fact the acts that now allow for extended supervision orders and the like. These are not trivial matters, and we'll be paying some quite close attention to that in the course of the Select Committee conversations, because the Bill of Rights Act is something we ought not to tamper with or compromise readily or without some really serious thought and evaluation of cost and benefits. So that's something we'll engage with at the appropriate level through the, as I say, at the Select Committee. So I mentioned that the nature of technology has changed. Historically, electronic monitoring has really been an electronic leash, if you like, something that tied an individual to a particular address. And okay, it had some value in that. It was, again, often a better alternative than imprisonment. But very limited technology, somewhat perverse characteristics, and that given that it operates on a radius from a given point, very few of us live in round properties, so it made it possible for people to do some strange things like jump the fence and visit the neighbour, but not actually be able to go to the extent of the property they were allegedly confined to. So imperfect technology, but it has got better. This new technology, the GPS technology, is much more enabling. It does allow people a level of freedom of movement, subject, of course, to them staying out of identified exclusion zones. And that's very positive. It means that people can be subject to monitoring, subject to this limitations on their movements, but it does allow them perhaps to go out to work, to go out to be educated, to go out and involve in positive social activities, to do their shopping, to develop these life skills that unfortunately a lot of our long-term inmates particularly simply don't have or lose in the period of their imprisonment. So it's a positive aspect of the legislation of the proposed bill in that sense, that it is more enabling. It enables people to be participants but fairly carefully monitored and to endeavour to limit their likelihood of them offending. But I think we have to understand that the monitoring is a very limited tool, albeit better than the old technology. It's a tool for managing, but it's not a cure. It's not a treatment. It won't in and of itself assure us that these people will stop offending in the long term. Of course, if somebody's wearing some sort of an electronic tag that enables people to be enables them to be monitored either in real time or for them to leave an electronic trail, if you like, of their whereabouts. That is don't to discourage people for the period they're wearing that bracelet or subject to that monitoring. but in and of itself, it will not change people's behaviours, it won't change their attitudes. To me, this electronic monitoring is a useful tool to keep people a little bit on the straight and narrow while we're investing heavily in actually changing their attitude, changing their behaviours, changing them in a long-term sense. So if anybody was unsure of the power or value or potential of rehabilitation, that have done well to join the Select Committee, the Law and Order Committee last week. Some members of that committee visited Rimutaka Prison, and we had a very compelling hour or so getting presentation from two young inmates, and they were young men, 20s, perhaps early 30s, who were not, they'd been on a violence management program for about 12 months, a very intensive program, one they found very difficult, and it has changed those young men for the better, undeniably. Their stories were different. They had no connection prior to prison, but unfortunately there were some very obvious and common characteristics to their background. Very early exposure to drug and alcohol abuse, dysfunctional families. The gang became the safe haven, the refuge. Their sense of identity was embedded in gangs and all the violent behaviours associated with that. These men were put into an intensive program for 12 months, and at the end of that year, they've broken through some barriers. Their level of self-awareness is what came through to me. They now understand that their offending hurt other people as well as themselves, that it wasn't a way to live their lives, that it didn't enable them to stand proudly as parents, as fathers. So rehabilitation can work if we invest in it, if we put the right programs in place and we sustain those programs over time. Because it's no good having a program in the community for 12 months, 18 months, and then can it through lack of funding. We need to identify programs that work for rehabilitation and reintegration, invest in them and sustain them over time. Because it takes a long time for somebody who's got 20, 30, 40 years of offending. You don't turn those people around in 6 months or a year or even 2 years. So these technologies are useful in providing a means of transitioning out of the prisons, which to my mind are often the worst solution, into community-based treatment and programs. It does, given that you cannot offer or expect a level of trustworthiness to some of these offenders who have proven themselves untrustworthy, the electronic means, the technologies do enable us to just keep them on the straight and narrow for a little while. But we mustn't confuse monitoring electronic technologies with solutions, long-term solutions. These are a means of enabling that transition to deal with the deep-seated causes of offending that has been embedded in their lives over time. So we're happy to support this legislation, albeit, as I say, with some ongoing concerns about the Bill of Rights Act implications of it, and we look to obviously minimise those and to see what best we can do with that. But I think we must recognise that technologies are useful, but of themselves are not a solution. We need to continue to invest in the long-term solutions, look for reintegration patterns. I'm always reminded of Anne Opie's book, From Outlaw to Citizen, where she makes a very clear and obvious statement that I think is perhaps not that obvious at times, that as well as offenders needing to change and being willing to come back into society, society needs to create a place for these people to come into, and that's a shared responsibility for all of us. So we'll support this bill. We look forward to engaging with the submitters and with our colleagues on the committee, and we hope to come out with something at the end that will be fit for purpose. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.